We're just going to start in a moment. There's more people entering the group. We want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to benefit from the whole briefing because this is an interesting one. Okay, so good morning, and you're very welcome to this free briefing by the Employment and Recruitment Federation, and it is on Ireland's gender pay gap reporting. It's an advisory briefing. It is not legal advice. So unless you're under contract directly with Mr. David Kearney in HR Brief, this is an advisory session for your benefit to inform you as to the responsibilities that we're going to have going forward. My name is Siobhan Kinsella. I serve at your pleasure as President of the Employment and Recruitment Federation, and I thank you for that honour. Today we have David Kearney of HR Brief with us. Now, Dave is a subject matter expert in employment law, in GDPR, in work permits, as we benefited from 2 weeks ago. And his business, HR Brief, provides advisory and legal services to many of the Irish recruitment industry. Now, most of you would say, I can't afford the likes of David Kearney and also Barrister Mary Siri Kearney, who's the other shareholder in HR Brief. So what Dave and Mary do is they operate on a retainer basis. And I am proud to say that I haven't been in the WRC in 8 years. Thank you, Mr. David Kearney, because he acts as my HR director as well and has done very, very successfully for the last 8 years. So in the event that you want to contact HR Brief and even explore your options or discuss your own company situation, please just email David. We call him Dave, but he is David. David at hrbrief.ie, and he'll be more than happy to give you information on and discuss whatever issues you want to explore with him. This is a hugely important piece of legislation that is coming in, and we have significant responsibilities under it. But one word of caution, and it happens every time we get European law. The European Union cannot set the law in Ireland or in any member state, and all EU-based law is transposed into Irish law by the Irish legislature. Now, if you look at, just as an example, the Agency Workers Directive when it came in, and the biggest difference that you have between Ireland and the UK in terms of the Agency Workers Directive is we got a derogation so that in the event that we put in writing to a client, we have the candidate, that they give us the candidate's pay rate, that we are no longer liable. That was not the case when it was transposed into UK law. So there will be anomalies in the transposition into Irish law of this legislation, and that will be settled by case law, no more than it was with the Agency Workers Directive. So just in advance of Dave starting the briefing, he's done an enormous amount of work on it, and we will be all over this as we are today and will continue to be. I just want you to keep that in mind if that's okay. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the esteemed Mr. David Siri Kearney, who I am happy to call not only a colleague, but a friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for taking the time from your very busy day to join us this morning for the AR briefing on Gender Pay Gap Information Act 2021. When I was studying King's Inns many, many years ago, they advised you to start a presentation with the good news, to put the negative stuff in the middle, and to try and finish on a high. So that's what I'll try and do my best this morning without boring you all to tears. The good news is that Ireland is probably doing better than people realise. So the concept of gender pay. So gender pay is not about equal pay. I know that almost sounds like a contradiction, but equal pay is already a legal requirement in Ireland. That is that men that do work of equal value or similar work must be paid the same. Regardless of their gender, men and women must be paid the same. That is a legal established right in law. Gender pay gap is different. Gender pay gap is about measuring the gap, the average earnings between all men and women in all organizations, regardless of their roles. So I know that can sound a little confusing, but it is primarily about the gap in average pay, the mean, which is an old English word, which means average, and the medium, which is a Latin word, which means the midpoint. And that's kind of the purpose and the whole purpose of the exercise. Its concept is around a long time. In fact, it's one of the founding principles of the European Union. It goes back to the Treaty of Rome of 1967. So this concept of equality between men and women, particularly in the area of pay and their value and worth, goes back a long, long time. It is measured across 28 countries, of which Ireland is one of them. You'd be happy to know Ireland is seventh on the list. The likes of Luxembourg is first, which has almost 100%. So in other words, they have a neutral and negative pay gap. Then you have countries like Belgium and Italy in the top three. They're at 97 and 90, 99, 97. So they're fast closing the gap down to a zero, which is fantastic achievement. Ireland, when we first kind of measured this around 2007, our gap, average pay gap was 17%. So that means in effect that women were being paid 17% less per hour than their male colleagues. And that was a pretty shocking figure in 2007. I'm happy to report, though, to be fair, and this is the good kind of news part, is that we're now down to less than 10%, or about 9.75%, which is amazing achievement over a couple of decades. And I don't know about many of you, but I suspect it's true. People of my age, certainly the social economic background was that I had a stay-at-home mom until, unfortunately, my dad died, Lord rest him, and my mom had to go to work and run our family business. But I had a stay-at-home mom because the social norms and the social acceptance way back when was that, men were the breadwinner, men went out to work, women took care of the home. Now, of course, that social norm has long since changed for all kinds of economic, social reasons and so on. And that is the genesis of where a lot of this thinking comes from. But that's old-fashioned now. It is not progressive. It is not modern. It is not respectful. It is not treating men and women in the same context that they need to be treated in. And to be fair, countries have made great strides. Unfortunately, countries like Latvia are at 19%. So they're way down the bottom of the list. So there's a big kind of gap between the top 10, which are in the seventh, and the bottom, 10, 18, where they're still way up in the double figures. So something to strive for. Most of this change has been brought around by men, because men are predominantly still the drivers of industry, still at the top in terms of most organizations. And that is something that needs to be borne in mind. It's about creating a culture and environment where women can be promoted, recognized, acknowledged, and valued in the workplace. Okay, I'm going to move on very quickly then to explain something. I was asked this question the other day, actually. Gender recognition, it's important that gender recognition is factored in to your understanding of how this works. So the Gender Recognition Act of 2015 allows any one of us to apply to the courts to have our preferred gender legally recognized in the state. So it's important, if you're approached, if somebody says, look, I identify as a man, I identify as a woman, regardless of what my birth said, there is a process for them to be legally recognized and to be included in the count. So it's not just a hard man or woman as people set out in terms of the law, but it is important to understand there are other people who choose to change their genders, and that should be acknowledged, identified, and embraced. So the primary legislation dealing with this is called the Gender Pay Gap Information Act 2021. It's governed by the Employment Equality Act, the Gender Pay Gap Information Regulations, and the EU Pay Transparency. Now, I'll go back to the EU Pay Transparency because there's a very peculiar thing in this that differs greatly from the Gender Pay Gap Information Act, which we'll debate a little bit further on, but it is something that's causing me a little bit of concern, if I'm honest. So from June the 1st, 2025, all employers with 50 or more employees must adhere to gender pay gap reporting requirements. The deadline shifts from December to November, giving organizations only 5 months. So if you pick a date in June, whatever date you choose to pick, you have 5 months, which will bring you to November. So in effect, if we accept, and we're going to debate this later on, if we accept that agencies are covered by this act, in other words, it's not up to your client to do, and I know a number of clients are doing it. So on the snapshot date in June, clients, I would respectfully suggest, are already capturing this information in their data reporting. So if you look at some of the big clients and some of the big reports, you can see on their websites that agencies will be factored in. So I suspect a lot of clients are already counting agency workers on that snapshot date in June and doing then a direct comparator, which they're obliged to do under the Protection of Temporary Agency Workers Act 2012. And they're including that in the reporting basis. Some clients aren't. They believe, as you know, they do with most other matters, believe that it's the agency's responsibility. And as I said, we'll debate that a little bit further on, but just to maybe start getting that concept into your head. That's kind of the timeline of what needs to be done. There is a new central government reporting portal, which will be launched in November, I believe. And that will, if you are required to report on that portal and on your company website. So it has to have public accessibility and transparency. And that's kind of one of the key purposes for it. Okay. The threshold, sorry, thanks, Anna. So this is the employment agency. This is your special considerations. And this is where probably that little bad news might be in the middle bit here, and we'll kind of deal with it. The employment agencies fall under the, so I've been in court, and Mary's been in court many times with many of you. We've had the privilege of representing you over many years, and we have experienced the courts.
Sorry, I need to make a coffee just to be on.
Sorry, Anna? You okay? Sorry, I had a bit of an interruption there. I wasn't sure what it was. My apologies. So we've been in court. Siobhan talked earlier about the introduction of the Protection of Temporary Agency Workers Act 2012. And there was about 100 cases. Mary and I were involved in a great number of those cases where we got clarification, we got an examination of the act in detail. And in a lot of cases, that was very helpful and very useful. There is no case law here. There is no European case law. We have nothing to really rely on to inform us of whether agencies are actually included in this count or not. So we're just going to debate that a little bit, if I may, and tease it out and see where it sits with you guys in terms of your own understanding. So the Act is very clear that on a certain date, and I read the Act, and the Act is not a long Act, but actually it makes no mention of agency workers in it whatsoever. It talks about the deemed employer, that who is actually considered the employer. Now, I know, because I've been in court many times with Mary over many years with you guys on various issues, and under most of the acts, I think there's only 3, you, the agency, are deemed to be the employer because you have the contract of employment with the agency worker. You are paying the wages, even though the client is paying the bill in terms of the bill out and the invoice, but you're actually paying the wages. You're making the deductions, you're filing the returns to social protection and revenue. And you take any of the familiar acts that we would have championed over the years with you guys, the Unfair Dismissals Act 1977, the Terms of Information Act 1994, Payment of Wages Act 2006, and so on and so forth. Redundancy Payments Act, which is a big one for agencies. You have always been deemed by the courts in Ireland to be the employer. In other words, the designated employer at a point in time in that material legal argument. I find it difficult to understand how agencies would successfully argue, should they be penalised under this act, how they are not the deemed employer on that day, that sample day, snapshot day as it's called. And I'll tell you why. Two of the biggest companies in Ireland, 2 of the biggest legal firms in Ireland, gave a briefing on this very question some time ago. And these 2 are very prominent. They actually advised the government And they're multi-million pound operations. And I want to quote to you their answers. I won't tell you which companies there are. You can figure that out for yourself. But they were asked a question in relation to agency, and their specific answer was this. In relation to an agency worker, the person who is liable for the pay of the agency workers should be deemed to be the employer for the purposes of the reporting obligations. Now, that's one very large company. The next very large company were asked a similar question on a briefing: which employees are excluded? And their answer was any individuals with the employment contract with an entity other than the employer, notwithstanding that they may perform work for the employer. Agency employees are excluded from the headcount as long as the agency employee is paid directly by the agency rather than the end user, which would be the normal model. So that is the considered legal opinion of two very prominent, well-placed, informed, and intelligent law firms in Ireland.
Yeah, just to get into the weeds on that. When the Lobbying Act came out, okay, you were very much in a position. So we're a membership organisation, so we talk to government on behalf of our members, and any interaction we have with a designated individual is considered lobbying. But you could have two scenarios whereby, if in doubt, what are you meant to do? So if this is going to be decided by case law, are we not in a position where you're you're subject to sanction if it's found to be your responsibility and you don't report it? So therefore, wouldn't you be better off with the devil, and saying, I'll report it just in case?
It's a great point, Siobhan. Thanks for making it, because it leads me nicely onto my next point. The next piece of legislation that's coming down the track is called the Transparency Pay Directive. And they clearly, we have got sight of the legislation. It is being transposed into Irish law in June of next year. The legislation is very, very clear. The directive is very clear. Agencies will be responsible. So agencies will be the deemed employer for the purposes of the reporting under the pay transparency. Now, if you follow that logic, the European Union have decided that at a given point in time, under this new act, that pay will be reported and the different metrics and the different categories of workers and so on, then one would have to assume that the intention of the legislator under the Gender Pay Gap Information Act 2021 was similar in their thinking insofar as who is the deemed employer at that point. And I would respectfully submit to everybody that I personally believe that the wisdom here is to actually engage in this reporting now. Even if you may feel, oh, come on, seriously, give me a break. We don't need this. This is a big undertaking, a big piece of work. You're going to have to do this next year anyway. There's no gray area here. There's no conflict of legal opinion. So when this is transposed into Irish law in June next year, 2026, this will become the responsibility of the agency under that directive and the new bill that will flow from that. As Siobhan explained, it's up to the Oireachtas to bring in, the European Union can't dictate national law, but they must transpose it to reflect the directive itself, a bit like the Protection of Temporary Agency Workers Act. So the wisdom and probably the logical approach to this is to engage in the gender pay gap reporting now. In other words, you will go back to June, you will take a snapshot date, you will then analyze the previous 12 months, and we'll get into what that looks like. Yeah, and as you can see there, so you choose any date in June as your annual snapshot date. You gather 12 months of data preceding your chosen snapshot date for comprehensive analysis. And then you complete all of there's 20 requirements under the Act that must be filled in to establish that average, that mean, and that medium, which is important, because you could have high construction, for example, is a good example, where construction has these huge variations. So you have people at the very top in terms of their skills, qualifications, abilities, and so on. Whether they're male, female is not the issue. And then you have this gap way down at the bottom, which is the general operatives in terms. So construction always gives this massive big skew. It doesn't happen in health by and large. By and large, health has a good gender balance. It doesn't happen pretty much in IT, financial sector. It does happen in teaching, for example. It does happen in some grades that would surprise you. But the reality here is this, I believe, and I'm just saying this respectfully, I believe the wise course of action here is for you now to engage in this process and to understand and to really get the culture within the business to start saying, you know what, we've got to do this anyway. This is just like reporting to revenue, to reporting to social protection. This is just another layer of doing business and administration. And the sooner you probably engage with it, the better. You've got to publish it, as I said, on your website and on the new government. So there's a new government portal being released in late October, actually, I believe. It must go up on the portal. And the other thing that has to go in is you have got to give some rationale, some reasonable, objective, informed rationale as to why that pay gap is there. And that can be traditional, social, it can be traditionally lower paid jobs. Women traditionally get paid less in childcare, in the care environment, and so on. But you've got to put in a reasoned analysis of why you think that pay. And more importantly, or as importantly, you've got to put in what actions the company are going to take. And I know within an agency that kind of sounds a bit daft because you're not necessarily in control of the pay rates because that's dictated to and governed by your clients. So it is about, like a lot of law that's written, as we found out through the years, agencies aren't always considered in the mix when the legislator sits down to do, the primary draft on this. And the legislation will always throw up a little anomalies around agencies. But, sorry, Siobhan.
No, I just want to come in there. For some people kind of approaching this, there's a question around the fact that the data is aggregated or how specific somebody can be. So I can, to my employer, I can put in a data subject access request with regard to information about me, but I can't request proprietary information about what you're paid or what my colleagues are paid. And there's going to be people on the call that are kind of saying, Jesus, can anybody in the company or external to the company put in a request to find out what she's paid versus what I'm paid? So can you talk a little bit to...
Yeah, it's a great point, Siobhan. Thanks very much. That's why you're on the big books, you know that. So the bottom line, I suppose, is this. You're obliged, as it is, to establish equality in the workplace. So let's just go back a little bit. The Protection of Temporary Agency Workers Act puts the responsibility on the agency to make all reasonable effort to establish equality in the workplace where agency workers are placed. That is done primarily by a request for information under your AWD request. So each year, twice a year, whatever you decide is appropriate for you guys, you should be sending out requests to your clients to ask them to fill in a questionnaire to confirm that a comparative worker employed by them directly is paid the same basic rates of pay, overtime, all of those issues. Is there a collective agreement in the workplace? Is there agreement with a trade union, for example? That is actually a legal requirement right now. That's what you should be doing. And I know a number of you do it because I've had the privilege to work with you over a number of years. So I know a number of you do. Some agencies don't. They just think, the client won't even sign the T&Cs, never mind send back an AWD. But if you're in court, if you're penalised, if you have to defend yourself, that's the evidence that's looked for. They'll say, where is your confirmation? So to answer your question in a roundabout way, Siobhan, the requirement is actually, it already exists and it should be done as a matter of fact. Your T&Cs should be signed by your clients. There's a big move away from agencies not getting their T&Cs signed. They're relying now on the client to sign their T&Cs and hoping for the best. And that is a disastrous move away from the traditional norms of getting, because in your T&Cs, you have that protection where you have the caveat that says any claim, no matter how it's generated or taken, if the company is in breach of the Protection of Temporary Agency Workers Act or General Employment Law, they will be responsible. If you don't have that, the first thing I know that they're going to look for in the insurance brokers is your signed T's and C's. Within that signed T's and C's, you are compelling the employer as part of a contractual agreement with you and the agency to supply that information. If they don't supply that information, then you can seek to be indemnified in a subsequent court action if you are found. Because remember, all actions under this act are taken against the agency. They're not taken against the hirer. None of them. So you've got to watch your back and protect yourself in terms of your own operations. But there is a move, there's a cultural move away from T&Cs. There's a cultural move away now to the big players imposing very difficult, very challenging terms of business on agencies that frankly are trying to push back on their liabilities to make you responsible and liable. And I know a number of agencies that frankly have been bullied into signing these T's and C's because they wanted to keep the business and they took their chances. And I can tell you, there's a few have fallen foul of that and have paid a very, very significant price for it.
I'm going to say the things that you can't say here, Dave, right? And that is that there is a push to some of the larger MSPs forcing agencies to sign their T's and C's, and there's a particular clause in it. And if you need help on this, send it to David Kearney for a review. But contracts are something that I spend an awful lot of time on. It's well established in Irish law under the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005 that if the agency cannot control the safety management system of the client's environment, that is the responsibility of the hirer, the person directing and controlling the worker on site. In the UK, that's not the case. So some of the MSPs coming out of the UK are getting agencies to sign their T's and C's, and it offers a blanket indemnity to them in the event that your staff member is injured on site. Now, Irish law isn't set up that way. Our insurance system isn't set up that way. The client is paying for insurance anyway. But the point being, your own T's and C's should be designed by a subject matter expert. Mine are designed by HR Brief, and they protect me well. But what I will say is, if you are signing a client's T's and C's, instead of getting them to sign yours, get independent legal advice before you sign anything. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Siobhan. I just got a question in, guys, on the penalties. So it's important I don't frighten the bejesus out of everyone. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to make commercial decisions. You've got to get on and run your business as best you can. And so let's just talk about the penalties for a minute. So it's kind of a peculiar kind of act. There is no financial penalty. So unlike other acts and other causes of action in court, there is compensation offered. There is 4 weeks' wages, for example, not having a contract of employment. There are things prescribed, set down in law. There is no financial penalty set down in law for breach of this act. There is, however, a possibility that an agency worker who's studying law and decides that they're going to test out all their wisdom and knowledge and decide they're going to report you to the WRC. So you could end up with a WRC inspection, and you could end up with a broader or wider WRC inspection that will look at all of your operations around timesheets, public holiday pay, annual leave, all that kind of stuff. And permits, which is always a difficulty for most agencies to keep on top of. So you don't want to bring that on top of you, and that's a possibility. The WRC can only order you to do it. So in other words, you're brought in front of the WRC and an order will be granted by the WRC, that's enforcement in the district court, that says, okay, come on, guys, stop messing. This has got to be done, and you'll do it. Of course, you'll comply with the order. There is a higher body, however, that can bring you to the circuit court or to the high court. Now, that's a whole different day out, whole different imagined set of expenses that you have to pay to defend it. So it's all about risk management. It's all about determining whether this is worth not doing or is this worth doing, which is going to, and as company directors, you are obliged under company law to act in a manner that protects the business and is not operating outside of the legal framework. So they are, and I know I'm beating you over the head at this stage, but I desperately do not want any agency to find themselves on the wrong side of this simply because it just looked too difficult to do or looked too cumbersome or just said, oh, seriously, give me a break. That we've got enough to be getting on. But these are the metrics. I know there's a number of accountants on this morning. You're very welcome. Big shout out to Neil. And I know this is your language, guys, and you love this stuff. And I really have huge respect for you. There's a great guideline, great information on the government website. If you go on and you Google Gender Pay Gap Information Act 2001 guidelines, it's really first class. I spent till about 1 o'clock this morning reading it myself. And it really sets out in simple is probably a stupid term to use, but it certainly sets out in language that's user friendly, is easily understood. I know a lot of you outsource your accounts. I know a lot of you don't have direct access into your accountancy, but these guys tend to be on top of this now, to be fair. This is their zone. This is stuff that they really thrive in and really, really good at. I've seen a few reports. Again, Google a couple of reports online that are TUSLA is a good one, for example. So have a look at what it looks like. What does this actually feel and look like in terms of what I might have to do and what I should be doing to protect the business as best I can. So the pay gap is the big one. There's 6 metrics around that, covering mean and median gaps. And the reason is because there's always extremes in a business. There's always higher enders, lower ends. And the mean is to give you the average. And the medium then is to give you the midpoint. So, for example, I was told this yesterday, if you have 10 employees and one is getting paid €1, €2, 3, up to 10, but then the midpoint, the median point, the mean average is 5.5. So even gobshite here could figure that one out. So that wasn't too difficult. So the bonus, watch the bonus one. Mary and I won a big landmark case last year under the Protection of Temporary Agency Workers Act, where bonuses were determined for the first time. So we had truck drivers in a very prominent business. You had agency truck drivers, and the truck drivers became aware of what the full-time drivers were earning. So they were getting money to show up for work, would you believe? They got paid every week just to be there. They got lunch money, they got travel money, they got, if they were 20 miles away, 20 kilometers, I won't give them away my age, 20 kilometers away from the depot, they got this, that, and the other. And that case was taken to court by 10 individuals against the agency. And thankfully we won it. And we won it on the grounds that some bonuses under the Protection of Temporary Agency Workers Act are not admissible because they talk about basic pay, basic conditions. This is based on gross pay, including all of the bonuses, benefits in kind. And there's something, again, the guidelines are there. They're very useful, very informative. It's all about taking a snapshot in time, men and women, like for like, different roles. Remember, this is not about what role they do. This is about the gender, men and women. What is the gap? What is the mean time gap? What is the medium gap? And that's really what they're looking for. The catch in it, and where some people struggle, is the analysis of it. The analysis of the data. How do you explain it? I mean, is there any logical reason to? Is it just because women are better at this job, or men are better at this job, or what's your own understanding, interpretation, and how can it be addressed? Now, I would respectfully submit that it probably can only be addressed in terms of your direct employees. I'm not quite sure how you can do it with agency workers, unless, as Siobhan says, you have that data where you can make that direct comparison. But you can see that on one hand, if the courts have ruled that agency workers are not entitled to certain bonuses, then even if you're comparing like with somebody in the bank, for example, who's an agency worker and a full-time, who gets a pension, who's not, which isn't included, for example, who gets lunch money, who gets travel, who gets whatever. That's not a direct comparator. It's very, very difficult to do. And I do understand that. And I can respectfully say that can be also reported on to say, look, there are barriers here to what we can do and what we can't do. I will ask the ERF, Siobhan. I think the ERF should make a submission to the minister on this to seek clarification. Now, I've done that. I have to be honest with you. I've done it twice, and the department have come back and said, we're not in the business of giving you legal advice. Kind of, it's up to yourself to figure it all out. And I said, thanks very much for nothing. But I just wonder if we raise it at a national level with the minister responsible to seek clarification that may be beneficial if it can happen quickly. If it can't, remember, you can't miss the reporting deadline, which is November. But if you pick a last date in June, well, obviously then we have till the end of November. But that's kind of your call, Siobhan.
No. I can confirm here for anybody who's interested that the ERF will definitely be making a submission to the minister on the matter. Two things I just want to say. So we're pretty much covered with regard to the Agency Workers Directive and the derogation in Irish law, so that if we ask the client for the rate of pay, the client provides the rate of pay. It's no longer in our control. We're no longer liable. So in the situation with our temporary agency workers, we're better off reporting it than not. With regard to our own people in our own organisation, so
you have to be over, you have to be over 50, Siobhan. That's the key point. So there might be, sorry for cutting across you, forgive my bad manners. So if you have agencies now that have 50 employees directly employed, they are included, regardless of what you do about temporary agency staff. So just to make that point, and thanks for reminding me, and that's an important feature. So if you have 50 plus staff as of today in your agency directly employed, you are covered by this act, regardless about what you decide with your temporary agency workforce.
And say that in the group that I'm part of, Facilitas, right? When we have different managing directors running different businesses, and say I'm knocking it out of the park and we're all on the same base salary, but forgive my ego here, this is hypothetical. But I'm money hungry, I'm commission orientated. This is everybody gets paid in the recruitment industry. So if I'm on the same base as somebody else, but I'm knocking it out of the park on commission, so that's hardly fair in terms of the reporting. And are we back to the aggregated data versus specific data here, Dave?
Yeah, you are. You see, everything is based on average. So it's all about a snapshot. If you take the European average at the moment is about 12%. I mean, there's highs and lows. So you have 19 in Latvia, for example. You have 0 pretty much in Luxembourg. But the average, the medium figure right now across Europe is 12%. Which is not bad. I mean, it's, I know it sounds dreadful, but I mean, it's come down dramatically in less than 2 decades. So I suppose what it also proves is it's doable. All this stuff is doable. One of the key findings of the European Union report recently was there's not enough women. There just simply is not enough women in senior positions to influence, guide, and I suppose inform businesses of the need to address this issue. Some people believe, and it's probably fair to say, we may never get to 100% because you might get a couple today who decide for their own family reasons that, let's say, the couple decide that the man is going to pursue his career. That's where the big earnings will be. And the woman is going to prioritize the family. Now, I don't mean that to sound sexist. I just mean that is a social reflection of a reality for many, many people today who make choices, but it is about choices. And ultimately, this is about companies acknowledging that gap in leadership and senior influencers within the business that aren't women. Because
you can't be penalised for that. This is just a matter of reporting
absolutely,
the reality of the situation within your
so, yeah, it's a great point, Siobhan. So I would rather you reported it and made a mess of it. And the old adage, it's much easier to seek forgiveness than permission. So I would rather you engaged with it, had a go with it, did your best, allowed for the limitations, acknowledging and highlighting the metrics that aren't available to you or you couldn't. And you know what? It's just culturally a better way to do business. It's better to be on the safe side than to be wondering, are you going to get a knock on the door here, a letter from the WRC or a summons to the High Court? I mean, I know people think that that's an exaggeration, but believe me when I tell you it happens. I've been to the High Court. Would you believe I was in the High Court for a person who only worked 6 weeks in an agency, 6 weeks, and we ended up in the High Court. So stuff happens, and you guys work too hard, and money is well earned, and there are a lot of people out there who will try and take it from you very, very easily if you let them. Anna, can I get the next slide there, please? Thank you. So that's the pay gap calculations. That's kind of what's expected. That's what's set out in the Act. They're looking for the average hourly. They're looking for the medium hourly. They're looking for the mean hourly. So this is part-time workers, temporary contract employees. That's primarily agency workers. Self-employed tend not to be included in this. So you might have some contractors, people can work with, they wouldn't typically be employed. It's a different setup. These are designated, what's called designated employees under the definition of what constitutes an employee, as opposed to, and that might be an issue for contractors who are placed by agencies. So you could have subcontractors are placed by agencies or paid through the agency. Again, I would respectfully say that they either do their own reporting or they're part of the client base. I would never see them being part of the agency base. And I know a lot of you guys engage in that type of model of work. Anna, can I get the next one, please? Thank you. Bonuses, watch the bonus, watch the benefit in kinds. Okay. It's kind of comparing like for like. There's no gray area here. Again, they're expecting you to do the average, the medium in all of those categories. And so you end up with this 20 kind of point reporting. I'll take the next one. I know I'm rushing a bit here because I really don't want to overwhelm you with tons of information. I know if you feel this is something you need to engage in or at least look into, there's a mountain of information available to you that's probably more user friendly than I'm making it being. So the pay, so this is the quarterly analysis. So not only do you have to get into the individual, but you've got to get into an analysis that's called the quartiles. Sorry, guys. And it's the top 25% of earners, percentage breakdown by gender. Then the upper middle, the lower, and then the lowest. Okay, and that gives you this scale of male, female, average, medium. That's the whole purpose of it. Let's look at a sector. Let's look at an industry. Let's look at a country. So at the moment in Ireland, it's less than 10%. In 2007, it was 17%. So huge progress made in 2 decades, less than 2 decades. In Europe, of 28 countries, including the likes of Malta, the average is 12% from a high of 20%. So again, great progress, really good news, I think. But as Fianna Fáil once said famously, loads done and loads more to do. Something like that, Siobhan, isn't it? And that's kind of where the journey is. So it's real. It's in the workplace. Women are determined, and rightly so, to have that voice, to have that equality, to have that respect, to have that value in the workplace. And it's incumbent on us all to ensure that happens. Certainly, in terms of your own employment. And it's often about, remember, potential employees can view these reports online. They can see your company, see if it's progressive, see if it's made any changes, see if it's over the next couple of years, how you've managed to tackle this and deal with it.
We're in a full employment economy, and the competition for talent is massive already. So I think that we're kind of subject to the aggregate of all of the 28 member states as opposed to a specific problem in Ireland. I don't think this is actually going to make any difference to what people are paid. It's just the obligation to report it to keep you clean.
Yeah, but it's a great point, Siobhan, but there's a danger now, guys, and I need to stress this. There's a danger you just think you have to take the box. And really what I'm stressing is it just goes more than that. It is about a narrative, about explaining as best you can your understanding of how the gap is there and what you're going to do about it, if you can do anything about it. Now, some industries get, but 2 pilots on a plane. I was in a flight recently, and the captain and the first officer were both women. There's no issue. So there's no issue with pay at that level in terms of certain, but that's really not the issue or the challenge. The challenge is to close that gap down as much as is humanly possible, because it can never be about men deserve to get more money because they're men, and women deserve to get less money because they're women. That can never be a sustainable argument in a modern society. It just isn't acceptable, and everybody knows that, and everyone agrees with that. Okay, so that's the mandatory. Remember, the narrative components are important as well, Siobhan, insofar as you've got to set out your reasoning as best you can, context and analysis, and then to give future commitments. Because I think it will spark an audit. If some genius decides in whatever department to look at this. And this is how WRC inspections often happen, by the way. They go in on a Monday, they pick out a list off the CRO, and they literally pick 10 companies to inspect that week and to notify them that they're inspecting. That's how a lot of inspections are done. They're not done on the basis of necessarily a complaint. The people in government departments look at these reports, they look and they analyze them. That's their job. That's what they do.
The reality,
Sorry.
same as when the Agency Workers Directive came in, that the WRC are going to audit companies as their own learning exercise, as their own curiosity as well. So when these reports come out, if you're providing your analysis, you have to be honest. If there's a reason that women and men are paid differently within your organization at a particular level, you're going to have to justify it. You should be justifying it anyway. But when it comes to WRC inspections, a lot of the time it's feeding the curiosity and trying to determine what the reality is going to be, or the accepted kind of methodology of how business is done, no more than we had, when the Agency Workers Directive came in. How are your holidays calculated if you're on multiple assignments? Is it aggregated? Is it not? Is the percentage of the hourly rate? What if there's a shift allowance? This is just going to be the same, that it's going to be decided over time, and you're better off getting out in front of it.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. So I suppose in conclusion, guys, it is the narrative needs to be honest. It needs to be an objective, a constructive analysis, and you're demonstrating genuine commitment. You may not be able to close it because, as we've said, this is often in the gift of your client. It's not in your gift. And obviously in your reporting, you're highlighting that about the restrictions, about gathering the data, comparing the data, how real the data is in terms of its presentation. But it is about transparency. It is, because this is going to get more of a requirement as we move on. So next year, when the new directive comes into the European Union, agencies absolutely are considered to be the employer. So on a given day, what does it mean? Well, it's a briefing for another day, to be honest. It's a very interesting directive, but you've got to advertise the job, and you can't talk about previous pay history, for example. You can't ask them their expectations about pay. It's a whole different approach to how this is done. The transparency is the big one, and that's why it's called the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and the impact it will have. As soon as we get a briefing on it, I'm happy to bring it to the ERF and to maybe flag it up to you guys, probably in early January, February, to give you plenty of time to get ready and to wish you well with it. I suppose is the truth of it. It's another layer. I know. When I got involved in recruitment many years ago, I met a very famous consultant who's now deceased, Lord rest her, and I was trying to frighten to be Jesus over about compliance and how smart a fellow I was and how good I was in court and how I knew all these agencies that had been fined. And all she said to me was, she said, "Look, Dave, I only care about filling the book, and I'll worry about the paperwork afterwards." So I know, I know at that time that was certainly the priority. And I do get that. And I say that very respectfully. But my job is to kind of beat you over the head as much as I can to say, look, there are other dangers here to the business other than losing the client. There are other challenges for the business other than, not filling the booking. So this is about the professionalism, the engagement, the acknowledgement, and the delivery of your compliance under all of these headings. I know it doesn't make it easy, but nonetheless, as a client, as an old colleague who's since deceased, Lord rest him, would say that's the law and that's the fact. Okay. So that's the conclusion, strategic next steps. So get your early preparation in, decide to engage with this or not. I'm saying to you honestly, there's a light touch approach. There is no big heavy fines. There's no big drama in the circuit court. But you could be unlucky enough to end up at a WRC inspection. You could be unlucky enough to end up in the High Court. Make sure your systems are robust, clear documentation. So this is an expressed employment law term. So it must be in your staff handbook, or it must be in your contract of employment. I would respectfully say your staff handbook, to draw people's attention to the rights under the gender pay gap, whether it's your client or you. That's yet to be determined. Proactive communication. and then continuous monitoring. You're familiar with all these terms, guys. You know, this probably, if you think about the permits and the CRM systems and monitoring permits, particularly the famous Stamp 2 with our Brazilian cousins, 70,000 of them now living in Ireland. And, you know, the nightmare where it's coming up, it's out of date or it's gone out of date and your CRM system didn't pick it up. This is just something else to consider in terms of your monitoring, how you're watching it, who's doing the reporting and all the analysis. If I can assist you in any way, if you want to ask me any questions directly, I'm very happy to take an email, come back to you personally. You can see my email is david@hrbrief.ie. I hope you found that useful and informative. I'm trying to end on a high note.
No, I'm not letting you off that easily, Dave. I have one or two questions for you.
Okay, go ahead.
So, in terms of a question relating to kind of 95% men in the construction industry. So, if you've got a different level of pay, because I've got 1 year service, you've got 3 year service, you've got 4 year service, you know, you're allowed to have different rates of pay based on different competence and experience. Fair?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the other thing is back to the conflicting advice as to the two very esteemed legal houses in the state. So essentially, what we're saying is if we've got agency workers, they're on the client site, chances are the client is going to be reporting the temporary agency workers, and chances are we're going to be reporting them as well. And that could very possibly be the case.
Or nobody's reporting them.
Or nobody's reporting them, yeah, which is worse again.
Yeah. I suppose there's always a danger relying on your client to do anything because that is not, and I say that respectfully.
Well, it depends.
But my experience of agency clients are, they tend to push back on the agency. They tend to say, your employee, they're quick to tell you when something goes wrong, that it's your employee, it's your problem, you sort it out, not interested, thanks very much. So I think the bigger professional organizations that probably have a dedicated HR department probably are doing this in truth, to be fair. I think smaller SMEs, smaller businesses where you might have 5 temps, you might have 10 temps, whatever, I wouldn't be sure they're doing it. So there's this vacuum of who's doing it. And maybe the question is to ask. Maybe the wise thing to do is to just ask the question, by the way, are you including, not that you shouldn't be or shouldn't, but maybe you ask the question and establish. So if you have X amount of clients and you ask the question and you get the answer is, yeah, we're all doing it. Well, happy days. Somebody's doing it and it's being captured and it's being compared in real time with that real organization who have the data. So yeah, that's good. That I think ticks the boxes. If you don't get an answer, which is probably what will happen in most cases, or you're not doing it, then there is a gap. And in that gap, somebody's likely to be caught out.
Somebody's likely to get sued.
I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
Again, just to recap, this legislation is applicable to organisations that have 50 permanent headcount or more, and their temporary agency workers independent of that. You're better off reporting the information now. Go to the government's portal, and in the event that you'd like to second guess or get a little bit more information and get direct specific advice relating to your own business and the methodology that you need to employ, the protocols, the documents, and the methodology, then please feel free to contact David at hrbrief.ie. As I said at the beginning, David is a subject matter expert on employment law, on work permits, on GDPR, and also HR Brief have added artificial intelligence and its governance to their suite of offerings. And I would very much
I make a mean spaghetti bolognese as well.
I think, yeah, I'll take your problem too. I can eventually buy a lunch. Listen, David Kearney of HR Brief, really, really appreciate your time here today, and thank you to all of the other agencies that are part of the Employment and Recruitment Federation. We at the Employment and Recruitment Federation, as Dave said, will be making a submission to government for a bit more clarity, but no more than any other piece of legislation that's been transposed into Irish law. Case law is going to decide it after the fact for any ambiguity. The only hope we have is that Mary Siri Kearney, when she's next on her trip to Brussels, might have a word with Mario Draghi to see if we can get a little bit less legislation applying to the SME.
Right. Tell Mary I said hello if you see her.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dave, listen.
Thanks very much. Good luck.